Morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. It's an absolute pleasure to welcome you all to the Arab Petroleum Investments Corporation webinar in collaboration with the 30% Club. Today, you join us for APICORP's inaugural event, which is part of a series that we will be hosting throughout the year. My name is Laudy, and I'm a partner at Full Impact Advisory in the Middle East and a member of the 30% Club MENA Core Steering Committee. Today, I'm absolutely delighted to be facilitating this special event, which is a key part of APICORP's mission to directly address the challenges and opportunities in the energy sector. Today's webinar serves as the launchpad for a much wider and sustainable campaign across the energy sector on this critical topic, with the purpose of finding solutions to creating an inclusive energy transition. Whilst the energy sector is vital to the global economy, like many other industries, it is also undergoing a fundamental change. In fact, what has been dubbed as the global reset. This change is brought about by the transition to a more balanced and sustainable mix that incorporates both renewables and decarbonized conventional fossil fuels to meet net zero goals set by global stakeholders, including both the private sector and governments, including many in our region. Today, more than a fifth of the world's largest corporations, with a combined sales of nearly $14 trillion, are estimated to have committed to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050 at the latest. The challenge for all of these corporations is to make their intentions real, to turn commitments into sustainable plans and actions, and they need to do this at pace and at scale. This requires a systemic change and a paradigm shift to put women at the center of adaptation and mitigation plans. However, rewiring a global economy that is almost 80% driven by conventional fossil fuels will be an extremely complex and costly mission, which will take time and will require comprehensive and sustainable policies. However, for the energy industry to truly reflect the world around us, there is one important yet often overlooked factor to consider: the significant underrepresentation of women in the industry across all levels. So why is this important? Extensive research studies have shown the impact that women can drive in their industries through diverse perspectives, critical thinking, as well as others, including purchasing decisions as consumers. According to a McKinsey study, companies ranked highly in terms of gender diversity in executive roles were 21% more likely to outperform on profitability and 27% more likely to have superior value creation. In the boardroom and across businesses, it's universally agreed and of course empirically proven that companies that successfully merge business goals with responsible ESG practices are the most profitable, sustainable, and resilient. Today's webinar represents a perfect opportunity for us to address the gender diversity challenges and opportunities in the energy sector and to discuss how we can work together and share best practices to collectively drive change in an industry that urgently needs it. The tone is always set at the top, and leaders need to pledge to drive this change. We have a packed agenda today. Firstly, we will hear from Dr. Ahmed Atiga, the CEO of APICORP, our host today, for his opening remarks, before moving on to our panel discussion. And following that, Raida Al-Sarairi, Director of Corporate Communications at APICORP, will introduce the 30% Club Toolkit to help support your D&I goals. I would now like to welcome Dr. Ahmed Atiga, CEO of APICORP, for his opening remarks. Welcome, Dr. Ahmed.
Thank you. Am I heard well?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Laudy, for this valuable introduction, and thanks for everyone actually who is taking part in today's very important webinar, representing just part of APICORP's campaign that we started very vigorously, in this case in partnership with the 30% Club, a partnership that we very much value, to realize gender balance within our workforce and across our sector. And for APICORP in particular, we sit at the intersection of two very important sectors, the energy sector with all its manifestations and the finance sector. At the end of the day, we are a financier and an investor. As Laudy mentioned, we have designed this webinar to help address the issues that the industry faces when it comes to gender diversity. But more importantly, to help companies attract, train, and retain and promote women within the energy in this industry. And I'll talk about what we have done in APICORP in this regard a little bit later in my remarks. Our approach to achieving these crucial goals is based on our own corporate values: integrity, accountability, excellence, and unity. And the Empower Toolkit that my colleague Raida will cover later is a life cycle approach to talent management developed by the 30% Club, which we will, as I said, Raida will talk about shortly. But we may maybe give some background as why parity matters. Research from different institutions, including financial institutions, have shown that the companies with women in senior leadership have seen at least 15% higher return on equity and 30% high return on equity relative to the peers who don't have this representation of women. In simple terms, there is now a growing irrefutable evidence that women bring a very different set of perspectives and worldviews into the workplace. And I can attest to that firsthand in my 30+ year career now at leadership positions in different organizations. Most recently with APICORP, I can definitely attest to this fact, both on the ground and in terms of the outcomes that come with a much better gender representation in the workplace. In the boardrooms as well, I'm sure many of us have served on boards and have recognized how the performance of women in a diversified boardroom brings value and brings much better decision-making process. In the energy sector in particular, this parity or this diversity becomes even more important for many reasons. And just to shed light on a few of them, women are disproportionately impacted by the effects of climate change and the energy supply dynamics. And we have seen what the last 2 years, for example, of the COVID-19 pandemic and the emerging global crisis that we are seeing every day. We have seen how these energy supply dynamics in particular affected areas where women may be more vulnerable than the rest of the population. Women also more likely to work in energy-intensive small and micro enterprises, such as food manufacturing and the like. This becomes more important than to give emphasis as to how to make sure that the contribution of this segment of the society, important segment of society, are recognized. Most children in single-parent households are raised by women, leaving them particularly vulnerable to energy shortages, price fluctuations, and cost recovery plans. And this particular element becomes more compounded in poverty-related or poverty areas in different parts of the globe. To sum it up, maybe I can, to sum up these reasons, maybe I can refer to what the IEA, the International Energy Agency, have said recently, in the sense that there is clearly strong evidence that companies who embrace more gender-inclusive pathways for women in senior management will be better positioned to navigate the unprecedented changes of the low-carbon transition, a transition that will be a long journey and has to be, in that sense, inclusive. On APICORP in particular, and I'll end with those remarks on how APICORP has embraced the diversity over the last 3-4 years in its workplace and in everything else we do. If we take the numbers to start with, over the last 4 or 5 years, we have increased female participation in the workplace, in the workforce of APICORP by 200%, reaching 16% of the total workforce, coming from almost 1 or 2% 4 or 5 years ago. This was an intensive and a very priority for APICORP to do and to show. And I must say that all women colleagues who have joined APICORP over the last few years at all levels of both management and professional tracks have shown tremendous contribution, hitting the ground running, as they say, and showing how an energy-focused financial institution can certainly benefit from that contribution. More broadly, APICORP has adopted an ESG framework, environmental, social, and governance framework, that encompasses all elements of diversity and gender balance, and looking at the decision making from a gender lens, as well as all other considerations at equal footing. The transactions and the projects that we finance or invest in, the due diligence now of these transactions has to have ESG considerations, including gender diversity, and how the companies that we support as investors or as financiers have to embrace gender diversity in their workforce in terms of equal opportunity, equal pay, equal leadership, and so on. So it has become really much more entrenched in how we do business, and how we look at the framework of financing to include gender at the core of sustainability and diversity. So to conclude, basically, we are at APICORP and in the region and in the sector at large, I think the journey of this particular topic we're talking about today has become real. It's no longer lip service, and really the institutions will distinguish themselves by completing this journey in the best way possible. To discuss these issues and to talk about their respective experiences within the energy sector and beyond, I'm very pleased that we have a special panel of experts from both APICORP and outside APICORP to bring this unique and important perspective to the audience of this webinar, and I really look forward to their contribution. Thank you very much for listening and for allowing us to do this first in its kind event for APICORP, focusing on this very important area. I will now hand back to Laudy with my full appreciation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmad, for your inspiring words and your insights, and most importantly, for your commitment to inclusion and diversity. And now we'll move to introduce our panelists to commence our discussions. We have a panel of experts who will also be sharing their knowledge and insights and recommendations on this critical topic. I will briefly introduce them, as they all have very extensive accomplishments and very long bios. And I'd like to start with welcoming Farah Foustok, CEO of Lazard for the GCC and founder of the Capital Club MENA. Farah is a highly successful leader in the financial services industry and has been consistently ranked in the Forbes list of most powerful women in business in the Middle East. She was founder of the REACH organization in 2013 and now sits on the advisory committee. She co-founded the steering committee of the MENA chapter of 30% Club and also sits on the global advisory board. In 2019, Farah was awarded International Investment Woman of the Year by Women in Investments Awards in London. She's also a member of the board of Room to Read in the Middle East. And she's an Aspen Fellow and launched her Tara initiative out of a purpose to connect female university students to the corporate world, increasing women's participation in financial services. Welcome, Farah. I'd now like to introduce Alicia Fernandez, Head of D&I for Bloomberg APAC. Based in Hong Kong, Alicia is responsible for driving Bloomberg's diversity and inclusion strategy across the Asia-Pacific region. Prior to joining Bloomberg, Alicia led the D&I strategy, programs and initiatives at the University of Melbourne. She's previously spent most of her career at the ANZ Bank, where she served as the firm's inclusion program manager. Welcome, Alicia. And now I'd like to welcome Basma Al-Mahrous, Head of Portfolio Management at APICORP. Basma is a senior executive with over 34 years of extensive experience in investment banking, projects development, process engineering, business planning, and trading. Basma joined APICORP in 2010 and since then has led several investment initiatives in the energy and petroleum shipping. She's played an instrumental role in enhancing APICORP's bottom line financials by leading and initiating the execution of several investment exits and loan restructuring. Welcome to all of our panelists. And let's commence our discussion. Today, a business strategy that considers ESG criteria is no longer just a nice to have, but indeed a must have. ESG analytics and disclosure continue to grow in importance. There is relentless demand from multiple stakeholders for greater and deeper ESG insights as sustainability analysis spreads across companies and departments. The launch of numerous mid-cap and small-cap ESG indices reflects that it's no longer just the largest companies recognizing the need to better position themselves globally through sustainable business practices. In fact, today we see more and more asset managers combine ESG and traditional financial analysis to drive their investment decisions. Farah, given the sophistication of investors is increasing and many do require data point insight into KPIs related to ESG performance, are companies incorporating ESG scores into their corporate strategies and investor communications in this region?
Thank you, Laudy, and thank you, Raida, for the invitation to be here, and Dr. Ahmad for your words. Again, I reiterate Laudy's initial comments that it's fantastic to have leaders' commitment to make the change. Maybe I take a little bit of a step back and talk about how we look at ESG as a firm. So globally, we believe that ESG needs to be integrated into everything we do. We believe it's a dynamic journey and it's not a destination. We started this journey as a firm in 2001 when we were one of the largest investors in the emerging markets. So started to integrate how we look at ESG within companies that we're following within our investment process. In 2013, we then started creating a quarterly watch list, an ESG watch list, to start looking at companies and how we look at different, as we have a scorecard, as Laudy mentioned, and we're looking at different factors within the environment, social and governance, and measuring some of these companies. In 2019, we then created something called a materiality mapping, which I can go into more detail later, which really looks at natural capital considerations, human capital, and governance. And we're looking across different sectors and trying to understand how these specific issues are impacting the productivity of these companies. And in 2020, we started launching thematic strategies that look at initiatives like investing in the upper and rising middle class within emerging markets. We have a strategy in the UK called Minerva that engages with companies and ensures that a minimum of 30% women sit on the boards and on executive positions. And we actually engage quite actively and encourage these companies and can use our proxy votes against these companies if we were to feel that things were not moving in the right direction. So our approach very much is a collective approach. We believe it's a collective responsibility of every individual within Lazard, whichever division you sit in, to actually ensure that you live, breathe, and work by ESG's philosophy, sustainable philosophies. We also believe it's about impactful ownership. And what does that mean? That means us as investors, we have the power of capital. We have the power to engage with companies that we invest in and constructively have conversations around outcome-oriented approaches, around how do we use our proxy vote to influence these companies. And the third thing is innovation. We are working within the firm across different sectors and also with different participants and companies within the ecosystem to collaborate and continuously innovate. And so we're seeing structural shifts that are happening in both the social and environmental segments, and they're concerns that are impacting the long-term earnings power of businesses. And so all these interconnections need to be addressed, which is why we are acting as, if you think stewards of capital, where we are actively engaging with companies. And for us, there is three things that are really driving this. It's regulation, whether it's carbon tax, discussions around fair wages in different regions, the shifts in consumer behavior. So you're seeing consumers starting to reach out and want to buy sustainable products, eat more sustainably, live more sustainably. And so that's a big shift in consumer behavior. And then technical disruption, whether it's electrical vehicles, renewable energy, all these different factors are driving companies and individuals and investors to really move into a more sustainable world.
Thank you, Farah. So many key takeaways in your response. I'd like to pick up on the collective action and move to Basima. Basima, as a veteran in this industry, you are aware of the ongoing persistent barriers to addressing women's underrepresentation in senior executive positions and on boards of energy companies. And this alarming level of gender disparity that extends across the energy industry continues to be a long-standing issue. What are some of the steps that the industry can take collectively to tackle these issues?
Thank you, Laudy. Well, what I would like to say that first, in general, there have been a lot of efforts made to empower women, and we cannot take that away from the industry. However, I believe organizations should still have a role by focusing on developing the skills on leaders to become more inclusive and hold them accountable for it. Also, there is an opportunity to create a culture that embraces inclusion as it being everyone's responsibility. And for that to happen, measurable targets and policies need to be in place. Having said that, organizations need to embrace diversity, but without making people defensive. And that can be done by focusing on positive outcomes. For example, advocating gender balance as a way organizations can achieve their strategic goals by unlocking the untapped talent. Another area that organizations can pay attention to is the fact that women participation rate drops significantly with age, leading to shortage of women in senior positions, and for them to serve as a role models for other women. Some governments have introduced reforms to tackle this issue. And I am proud to say that Saudi Arabia is one of those countries that have increased the retirement age of women from 55 to 60 years. And I really hope that other regional countries do the same.
Thank you, Basma. Of course, a more inclusive culture is everybody's responsibility in the organization, and this focus on positive outcomes. I'd now like to move to Alicia. Alicia, there's a very strong business case for diversity across the spectrum, including gender diversity and ethnic and cultural diversity in corporate leadership. And this continues to strengthen. Yet we all know that progress has been very slow. Can you share your views on what needs to be done in this region and more specifically in the energy sector to drive inclusion and diversity?
Thanks, Laudy. Firstly, I want to just acknowledge APICORP's effort. I think going from next to nothing to a 200% increase in such a short time is commendable. And the fact that you're doing this panel is innovative in itself. So I just wanted to make sure I acknowledge that. Now, with regards to your question, now I think that the evidence is clear, right? We continue to see a pipeline problem in the energy sector. And in fact, actually, we see it across all sectors. But in regards to the energy sector specifically, it has one of the largest opportunities for growth with regards to gender equity, for example. It's not enough to just competitively hire, which, to be honest, what I've seen is actually in the energy sector itself has done a really good job in the fact that the money on offer and the incentives provided to attract women to the industry has been much higher, and the pay gap is not actually there. But it's not enough to just hire. Firms have to really focus on the rest of the ecosystem. And part of that is the inclusive culture. Because if you don't, what you're neglecting is the retention and the risk that you're not going to have a pipeline of women to then step into leadership. And you're creating a problem within yourself, which is the leaky pipeline. You bring people in, they don't feel included, they don't feel like they belong, and then they leave. And so that inclusive culture then becomes really important. So diversity in the energy sector, as we know, and as you've correctly pointed out, is not just about women, but if we can just zero in on the gender notions. So 3 specific things that I would call out that we could do. Firstly, upskill women into more technical roles. I think historically, perhaps we haven't done a good job as an industry to do that. And women have been relegated to HR functions, communication functions, administration functions, and back office functions. So upskilling women to take on more technical roles is one thing that we can do. The second thing I would say is positioning women in revenue generating functions within the organization. I think if we can do that, if we upskill them and then we can put them in those roles, that sends a really strong message, not just to the industry, but to the next generation of female talent. Lastly, I would say creating an inclusive culture. If you can't create an inclusive culture, that's where your leaky pipeline will then happen. And so when I say that, people ask me, well, what do you mean by that? And I say there's 4 fundamental things. If each and every one of us as individuals can do these 4 things, we can create an inclusive culture. And that is creating an environment where every single person you interact with feels welcomed, safe, valued, and respected. Welcomed in your presence, safe, and I mean safe both psychologically and physically, and especially in the energy sector. This is a big, I think, point where you can make the biggest strides, because maybe historically with the way that your roles and your jobs have been set up, it hasn't been so physically safe, but with the move to clean energy and the differences in roles that are created, there is a big opportunity there in that safety aspect. Valued. So how can you as an individual and as a firm and as leaders create an environment where every single person feels like their contribution is valued and then respected as who they are? So welcome, safe, valued, and respected. So if you can do those things, I think you're halfway there.
Fantastic takeaways. Thank you, Alicia. So it's not enough just to hire, because then we risk continuing this leaking pipeline. I'd now like to move to Farah and focus on Lazard's priority of ESG issues. Are they incorporated into general risks? Are they embedded into the corporate strategy? And I know you've touched on that earlier. And what do you use at Lazard as a standardized metric to rank and score listed companies through a common ESG lens? Perhaps you can talk about the S and the G in your scorecard.
Thank you. And Alicia, it's great to see you again. We seem to be appearing on the same panel, so I'm becoming a big fan of yours. I love this welcome, safe, valued, and respected. I think we should all take that on board. So Laudy, thank you for your question. Maybe I will just focus on the energy sector, because I think with our materiality mapping, it goes across sectors. So if I just look at the energy sector, we would look at, for instance, the natural capital considerations, things like biodiversity impacts, water and waste management, climate change transition, risk carbon pricing. And then if we move to human capital, we would look at employee health and safety, which Alicia touched on, human rights. The governance piece, we're going to touch on board independence, accountability, and diversity, executive compensation, independent audits, and shareholder rights. So I think that, you know, whether you're looking at developed markets or emerging markets, clearly the metrics are quite different. Now, we have an investment team on the ground that is engaging quite actively with companies here, but clearly we're quite far behind the rest of the world when it comes to ESG metrics. And so our conversations are more around education and then just rather gathering data. So we're gathering information at the level that we can and trying to map out whatever we can on regional publicly listed companies. But we're not really at the level of the rest of the world. I think Europe and the Scandinavians are far ahead. I would say even more ahead than the US. And we are still in kind of the emerging market state where we're still catching up and still learning. But there are clearly many best practices around the world, even in the energy sector, which I can touch on later. But typically when we're having conversations and with companies, probably 40% of the dialogue is now around the ESG. And 30% of the conversations about the E, the largest piece tends to be the S, which is about 38%, and the remainder is about the G. And so there definitely is a shift in the mindset. There's definitely a lot of awareness that's been done over the last couple of years. I think COVID has accelerated the change. And as many people on the panel already have said, we can no longer ignore the changes, and we really need to engage wherever we sit at the table. We sit at the table where we have the influence of capital, and therefore, we are very much engaging and trying to make the difference.
Thank you very much, Farah. I'd now like to move to Basma. We've heard from Farah on the S and the G in the ESG scorecard. We've heard from Alicia on the upskilling and positioning women in revenue generating positions. What actions do you believe that the energy sector can focus on to accelerate change?
Yes. See, on the energy sector, I think we are starting from a very low base in general. For example, in boardrooms, you are seeing less women being there, and I myself sit in a number of boards in our investee companies, and to be honest, it is sometimes close to none, close to zero. So I believe we should not shy away from introducing quota system, and that is there in the Western world, I believe. And by introducing the quota system, we would encourage companies to accelerate the inclusion of female talents in that aspect.
So on that point, Basimo, so you're saying that you don't believe quotas are necessary? I didn't get your point.
No, in fact, the opposite. I believe that introducing quotas could be one of the solutions. And I'm saying that we should not shy away from it, because I know that some people look at it negatively, and people would say that, well, women should earn it. From my experience, yes, we have to earn it. Women in general have to earn their promotions or the opportunities, but we are starting from a very low base. Mm-hmm. So introducing quota system could help encourage other companies to accelerate the inclusion of females.
Thank you. And I think this is what we're seeing globally through the 30% Club global chapters, that there are so many countries that actually have enough evidence to show that quotas work. And from the perspective of women having to prove themselves, there is an abundance of exceptional female talent out there. And it's really, connecting the demand and the supply. So on the topic of global best practices, I'd like to move to Farah. And Farah, can you please share with us, you kind of touched on it earlier, some of the global best practices of what works best to drive diversity through the ESG lens?
So I'm going to, again, go back to the energy sector. I don't know if any of you are aware of the report that BP put out, 2022. So BP put out an incredible report talking about 2022 and the reinvention of BP with ESG at the core of their strategy. And so they talk very much about engaging the stakeholders and embedding ESG into the DNA of the company, and really setting out very clear metrics, very clear goals and targets, 5 for the people at BP and 5 for the planet. And I think you go back to Basma's comment on targets and on quotas. So I'm a big fan. I wasn't many years ago. I'm a big fan right now of very firm numbers and targets being set, because I think we're just taking too long to move the needle. And I think unless targets are set, leaders don't step up and move forward fast enough. And so it's not enough to set targets for 2050. We may not be alive in 2050. We need targets for 2025. We need targets for 2030. We need targets that are really achievable. And I believe that regulators, stock exchanges, and the public market space, I believe that investors, asset allocators need to demand specific numbers to be met by companies, because I don't believe that this will happen fast enough in our lifetime if targets are not set to be achieved. And if you go back to the initial, how do you even reach these targets? You need to actually have baseline data. You need to understand where you are today. You need to be able to measure. And I think in this part of the world, that's a little bit more difficult. It's becoming a little bit more visible, but companies need to be willing to disclose, whether it's voluntary disclosure, but really disclose and talk about where we are today and where we would like to achieve.
Fantastic, Farah. Targets are indeed integral to move the needle. And of course, data is key, because what can be measured can be managed. And that takes me to my question for Alicia. And Alicia, you've done a lot at Bloomberg, and you've recently launched the Bloomberg Gender Equality Index. Can you please share with us its success so far and the progress that organizations have made in implementing and using the index?
Yeah, let me take a step back before I go on to that. I wanted to just paint the picture of what we know and why it's important. So what we know, for example, and building on what Dr. Ahmed said, according to the OECD and the International Energy Agency, There are, they did a data collection exercise that covered over 2,500 energy-related companies recently, and it revealed that that women make up less than 14% of senior management, and 5% of women reach CEO level. And further to that, over 25% of the participating firms, so the 25% of the 2,500 firms, had few or no women in leadership. So there is already a story to tell there. Now, building on that, the IMF has been cited in saying that having more women in the workplace could increase GDP by up to 35%. Now, based on 2021 estimates, that could mean an additional $140 billion to the UAE economy. So that's the business case. That's why. Now, if I talk about our GEI, so our GEI helps, and this is why Farah and I have crossed paths. We both did a panel discussion for actually the Singapore Stock Exchange recently on this very thing. But our GEI helps publicly listed companies around the world increase their breadth and depth of ESG data to investors, specifically the S. This year, we had 418 companies representing a combined market capitalization of $16 trillion and headquartered in 45 countries and regions and across 11 sectors. It was a record year for us, and we've seen a 20% increase year on year. Now, the GEI framework scores companies across 5 key pillars: female leadership and talent pipeline, equal pay and gender pay parity, inclusive culture, anti-sexual harassment policies, and having a pro-women brand. Now, on average, our GEI member boards are comprised of 31% women. So we're meeting the 30% club target there from our GEI members. And 72% of the member companies have a chief diversity officer or an executive that has the primary responsibility for diversity and inclusion. Now, if I drill down a little bit and talk to you specifically, a little bit more specific.
We've got a couple of minutes left, Alicia, so I
will be very quick.
Thank you.
So we worked with the EGX and took part in some research and in conjunction with the 30% Club. And what we do know, and what I wanted to share, is not specific to the region, but we had 18 companies in the energy sector that participated. And the energy sector itself has the largest increase in female leadership score year on year. So that's what I wanted to share.
Thank you very much. Some incredible statistics and data that's very positive and uplifting. And congratulations, Raida, actually, for your involvement with 30% Club and the Egypt Stock Exchange on launching the Gender Equality Index. And for the final question, and we are running out of time, I'm sure we can talk for another hour. It's such an exciting panel that we have. I'd like to move to Basima. And Basima, I'd like to ask you, what is APICORP doing internally to move the needle on gender diversity? And if you can also give us some advice to any women in our audience this morning on how they should be looking to seize opportunities in this sector.
Yes, APICORP, like many other institutions in the energy sector, have been striving to increase women participation at all levels. And especially, I would say, under the leadership of Dr. Ahmed over the past 5 years. And he have already shed light on some of the achievements. And I must say that today's event and the fact that I am being given the opportunity to make my voice heard are some of the steps that has been taken by APICORP towards embracing diversity. As far as my advice to my women colleagues and the wider spectrum, I would say, based on my over 34 years of experience, I cannot stress more about the importance of enhancing the skills, knowledge, and abilities. And for women, and that is to be honest, for females and males. And for women, I encourage them to take steps to ensure their hard work is recognized. This is really a difficult part of our career. although it seems unpleasant to show our achievements, but, and it has to be very clear to all of us that by not doing so, we lose the chance to influence the outcome and stay behind.
Thank you very much, Bassamo. Some great tips and takeaways there. And indeed, enhancing skills and knowledge and ability applies to everybody, particularly in 2022, as we face a very different world moving forward. And I love the advice on taking steps to ensure that your hard work is recognized. In fact, I've been based in the region for nearly 20 years, and a very senior Emirati mentor once said to me, you must report what I called was wejbati in Arabic. So thank you very much. I'd like to actually thank our expert panelists for their extremely valuable contribution and great tips and takeaways, and what a fantastic and insightful discussion. We will now move on to the Empower Toolkit session of our agenda. Women indeed face challenges at every stage of their career, in non-traditional occupations such as those found within the energy sector. At the 30% Club, we believe to make a difference, we must tackle these barriers faced during recruitment, retention, promotion, advancement, and leadership. APICORP's approach to achieving gender diversity is based on the Empower Toolkit, which is a life cycle approach, as we heard from Dr. Ahmed earlier, to talent management developed by the 30% Club, a global campaign that is led by chairs and CEOs taking action to improve gender diversity at every level across their organization, including boards and senior leadership levels. The ultimate objective here is for companies to commit at least 30% female representation on their boards and executive leadership teams, because this is the critical mass at which minority voices become heard. The ultimate goal is, in fact, parity. I will now take the opportunity to introduce our colleague Raida Al-Saraira, Director of Corporate Communications at APICORP, who will present today's training and the 30% Club Empower Toolkit. Welcome, Raida.
Thank you, Laudy, for the introduction, and thank you, everybody, for your very insightful discussion around gender in general and gender in the energy sector. I'm going to start sharing my screen so we can go through the toolkit. And just a very quick background, this toolkit is a regional effort that was developed by the 30% Club in MENA in participation with member firms. That includes over 40 member firms that participated in creating this toolkit. It looks at what companies have done and what worked and what did not work, and also looks at ways to enhance those initiatives to actually create a much larger impact. Funny enough, a lot of the points that you mentioned over the panel, our panelists mentioned, are actually included in this toolkit, from the culture and the tone from the top down to skilling women and ensuring that the pipeline is very strong, healthy, and does not leak along the way. Because the ultimate goal here is to attract, retain, and promote women into senior roles and converge a culture that is extremely supportive and inclusive of diversity, starting with gender. Or the 30% Club MENA narrative focuses on talent, driving talent, be it men or women. However, women talent are lacking opportunities simply because of certain stereotypes and unconscious biases that exist at the organizational level. So we're going to start. The first basically slide is actually what Alicia mentioned in terms of the numbers and the macro and micro case for change. I'm not going to deep dive, but if we actually utilize female talent globally, we are able to add $12 trillion to the global GDP by 2025. That's massive number when you look at global economies. Another point I'd like to drive is the difference between women representation and participation in the traditional oil and gas sector versus the renewable and new energy sector. And there's about 10% difference between the two sectors, and that's mainly driven by the nature of business and the opportunities presented by the renewables. Traditional oil and gas requires STEM-based education and skill set that currently might not exist within the wider employment pool amongst women. However, the renewable, you've got thought leadership, research, planning strategies, ESG, all are actually providing opportunities for female participation within the workforce. The toolkit, I'm going to deep dive into the toolkit. The toolkit covers 3 areas of talent management. And although this looks like an HR slide, it is not. HR is an enabler and a platform to drive a lot of the initiatives around diversity and inclusion within an organization. However, driving the toolkit should be the responsibility and need to be the responsibility of the leadership of the company. So it covers 3 main areas of focus: attraction, and then retention and development. And the reason we look at attraction, retention, and development, while at the lowest levels of job hiring, we see almost 50% female hires versus male hires. We actually, that number starts going down as women move into mid-management, and then a sharp decrease from mid to senior management. And that's why looking at the attraction point is really important to drive the numbers and keep them high enough for us to have a good percentage of women entering the leadership position. These 3 areas cover 8 key themes, starting with recruitment, career planning, leadership pipeline, diversity strategy and policies, compensation and benefits, culture, training, and outreach. So as you see, these 8 key themes are reflective of the discussion that we had today from our panelists and from our CEO. The toolkit in itself is not a set-in-stone document. It is designed to actually allow companies adopting the toolkit to look at the various elements and various initiatives and adopt initiatives that are actually aligned with their strategy. You're not expected to drive 40 initiatives in year 1. You might want to focus on attraction, you might want to focus on development, you might want to focus on all 3 areas, however, mix and match the initiatives. The toolkit starts actually with a baseline survey. There is a full baseline survey that companies would probably want to answer and look at where they are in their diversity and inclusion journey. And by the end of the year, again, answer the same questions and look how much they've actually progressed against certain initiatives. So the baseline is aligned with the initiatives mentioned in this toolkit. And it's a live document, so there is always tracking, there's analysis, update, and then we disseminate again if there's a need to do so. As we all heard, diversity and inclusion in general has to actually align with the culture and values of the company. However, to drive transformation and gender diversity, we have to look at certain values that we believe will really help companies advance and progress diversity within their ranks. And those values are commitment, and that's the commitment that we spoke about from the very top, the culture, the CEO driving the strategy. Being persistent, gender diversity is not a discussion that we have in the month of March in the year. It's an ongoing discussion in every meeting that happens at the level of management and cascaded downwards. There has to be accountability, and that only comes from tracking and measuring the progress you have within the initiatives that you adopt. It has to be definitely inclusive. Alicia spoke about being safe. Dr. Ahmed spoke about collaboration, and those things come up in an environment that is inclusive. And then, of course, innovative, and that's really where sometimes some of the biggest impact comes. I know setting targets and quotas is not an innovative approach, but it can be something designed to help accelerate gender diversity within organizations. Under the attraction area, we've got recruitment. And each area has several themes, and every theme has a number of initiatives that can help you start the gender diversity journey within your organizations. So basically, when we talk about recruitment, certain initiatives could be around blind recruitment, could be around having a policy within the applicant pool, quotas for senior role, and transparent recruitment process. What is really important in this toolkit, it describes the initiative. It tells you what usually good looks like and what great looks like. And what great looks like is what we want you to be a part of and adopt, because that's where we see the biggest change happening. Having a policy around 50% CVs submitted that represent women applicants is really important. Training your recruitment teams on unconscious biases is good. However, training them on using the language that removes biases and job descriptions and application forms is even more important. So this kind of setup helps you decide which initiative or a set of initiatives that would allow you to make the biggest impact within your organizations. And usually each organization has a set of challenges. It could be access to talent. It could be access to a well-educated employee pool base. It could be ability not to find the right professional experience within the ranks of the company. So depending on what you feel your company needs, and that's a discussion that should happen at the management level with the support of HR to have one voice to drive those initiatives. The same thing goes for career planning, whether it's setting up development plans, setting up understanding exit interviews, especially around women, creating sponsors and mentors within an organization, introducing coaching. These can help with career planning, because oftentimes people and women who are not able to see how their career progress with an organization and how to actually benefit from the networking, they lack the ability to see the opportunities presented by the organization in terms of promotions, in terms of stretch assignments, and in terms of projects. They do need to understand the ecosystem they work in and what opportunities they have, so they can actually take the stage and provide a irrefutable evidence that they are willing to step up and are able to step up. In terms of leadership pipeline, Alicia spoke about the leaky pipeline. This is one of the biggest challenges of finding women who can serve in leadership positions and eventually in the boardroom. It's because, as I mentioned, the number of women entering any workforce, and not just the energy sector, they start at almost 50% representation, and that number or percentage drops tremendously as they move into the ranks, into middle management, and even become very scarce when they move to senior roles. And some of the initiatives here that actually can help increase the number of women in the company that enter the leadership pipeline, things like client exposure, development, high-end development program. We're not talking about, giving them presentation skills or communication skills. It's about really putting them on programs that help them understand how to deal with internal and external stakeholders, how to carry a project from start to end, understanding profit and loss within the company. And Alicia, you spoke about this. So looking at development program, and definitely most importantly, having a robust succession planning mandates, where I've sat on teams before joining APICORP where there was a mandate within the succession plan to have at least one woman be in the succession plan for the next 3 years for any senior role within that organization. So I think when you have that leadership commitment, these initiatives become easy to adopt and implement. Again, it's good to have initiatives, but also looking at the wider diversity and inclusion strategies and policies. There are things that probably not as much solid in terms of yielding results, but could be really important to driving an inclusive culture. D&I leaders, Bloomberg has really pioneered the D&I operations, and we know how committed the top leadership is and how they're driving diversity and inclusion across the entire company. A lot of companies have D&I leaders, but for smaller companies that are not able to have D&I leaders, maybe have the D&I culture shared amongst the top leadership. Humanizing the organization by having women and leadership tell stories around the importance of women in leadership and on boards, and encourage groups to actually have discussions within the organization. This is really important. And of course, evaluating your policies within diversity and inclusion within the organization. And I'm not going to go through every single slide here. It's self-explanatory. So you've got initiatives under compensation and benefits. You have initiatives under organizational culture, and of course, training, as you mentioned, as part of those 3 areas that we spoke about, and outreach strategies that can help with recruitment, career planning, and all of the initiatives that we spoke about. What I wanted to actually get to is the last few slides. Implementation. I mean, every organization can say we are going to focus on bringing and increasing the number of women in our ranks, but actually implementation stays as the #1 biggest challenge in terms of yielding results. Only 20 companies, through the data that we've collected, are able to make progress when it comes to diversity. And for varying reasons, these challenges exist. And the reason that only 20% is because there is not a holistic approach to diversity and inclusion within an organization. Having a recruitment policy is not enough. Having a tone from the top is not enough. Doing events is not enough. It has to be an inclusive approach and a holistic approach to be able to achieve results within the ecosystem that we're speaking to right now. And the other thing is the ecosystem and how these initiatives should be actually driven. Again, we're talking about how can we increase the success of these initiatives. It starts from the very top. CEO and management commitment, but also even board commitment. Board drives a lot of the strategies around the business, and I think diversity and inclusion should be at the board. The second dimension for action is transparency and measuring progress. And of course, third and fourth is women leadership development, and this has been spoken about a lot in this panel, and diversity enabling infrastructure. This is kind of the framework for implementation that you should look at when you start implementing any or all of the initiatives in this toolkit. And we also included in the last 2 slides the framework for implementation across all of the themes, looking at success factors, looking at potential barriers, looking at accountability and KPIs to measure. So as you look at the initiatives, this is the framework that each initiative should basically respond to, and this is how you are going to monitor the implementation. So basically, we have the last 2 slides that talk about the framework for each of the themes under the 3 main areas that we spoke about. This is the last slide. I just want to say that this toolkit and the baseline survey will be available on the landing page on APICORP website. It will be a permanent page for us. As Laudy mentioned, this is the first of a series of events that we're going to do this year. And we're going to allow access for those who attend our webinars to be able to download and use the toolkit. At this point, I think we reached the end. We're a bit 4 minutes above time, but I hope it was clear enough for all those who are attending and understand how to use the toolkit.
Thank you very much, Raida, for an excellent presentation of a very actionable toolkit. Thank you everyone for joining us today and for participating in today's session. Thank you to APICORP, Dr. Ahmad, Raida, and the team for hosting this very special webinar. A huge thank you to our expert panelists, Farah, Basima, and Alicia for your invaluable contribution. And we look forward to seeing you all again in APICORP's upcoming events and webinars, where we will continue this very critical dialogue, which is part of APICORP's commitment to overcoming the gender gap. Thank you, everyone, and I wish you a great afternoon.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.